There are no cities, no roads, no warm homes, and no modern tools. The land was ruled by nature. Vast grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, ancient trees stood beside rivers, and dangerous predators moved silently through the tall grass. For the early humans living here, every sunrise meant another fight for survival. Food was difficult to find. Water could be dangerous to reach. A moment of carelessness could bring a predator out of the shadows. But even in this harsh world, something powerful existed: love. Among a small group of early humans lived a young man and woman who had grown deeply attached to each other. They had no written language and no way to record their feelings. Yet their connection could be seen in the simplest things. Every morning, when the first sunlight appeared over the horizon, they walked together into the wilderness. The woman searched beneath bushes for edible roots and fruits, while the man watched the surrounding grassland for danger. Whenever she found something useful, she would look toward him, and he would smile. Sometimes, they simply walked side by side without making a sound. Their world was quiet, but their actions spoke for them. When she became tired, he stayed close. When he was injured, she remained beside him. When danger appeared, neither wanted to leave the other behind. One evening, after a long day of searching for food, they returned to their small shelter near a rocky hillside. The sky was turning orange. The last sunlight passed through the branches of an ancient tree. They sat together beside a small fire. The woman slowly moved closer and rested her head against the man's shoulder. He gently placed his hand beside hers. For a moment, there was no fear. No predator. No hunger. No struggle. Only two early humans sharing a peaceful moment together. But prehistoric Africa never allowed peace to last for long. Suddenly, the sound of movement came from the tall grass. The couple left far. Golden light slowly spread across the grasslands as the small group of early humans began another day of survival. The young couple woke beside their simple shelter. There was no comfortable bed, no stored food, and no protection from the dangers outside. Everything they needed had to be found. The woman looked toward the distant river. The man watched the surrounding grass carefully. They knew that water meant life, but the river also attracted some of the most dangerous animals in the region. Still, they had to go. Together, they began walking. The tall grass reached around their bodies as they moved slowly through the wilderness. Birds called from the ancient trees. Small animals disappeared into the bushes. Somewhere in the distance, a large predator roared. The woman instinctively moved closer to the man. He reached for her hand. They continued walking. After a long journey, they finally reached the river. The water looked calm beneath the morning sunlight. The woman knelt down and began drinking. The man remained standing nearby, carefully watching the opposite bank. Suddenly, the water moved. He immediately raised his hand. The woman stopped. For several seconds, they stared at the river. Something large had moved beneath the surface. They slowly stepped backward. A pair of eyes appeared near the water. The couple understood the danger. Without making a sound, they moved away from the river. This was their world. Every tree could hide a predator. Every river could become a trap. Every journey could become their last. Yet they continued, because survival demanded courage, and love gave them another reason to keep going. Later that day, they found a large tree filled with wild fruits. The woman carefully collected several of them. The man climbed onto a low branch to reach the higher fruit. When he returned to the ground, he handed the best fruit to her. She looked at him with a gentle smile. It was a tiny gesture, but the storm had passed, but the wilderness was still dangerous. The following morning, the early human group woke to a completely different landscape. The ground was wet, the grass was covered with tiny drops of water, and a thin mist floated above the river. The young couple stepped outside their shelter. For a moment, they simply stood together and watched the sunrise. The woman looked peaceful. The man smiled at her. But neither of them knew that this day would change their lives forever. The group decided to travel toward a new area where they hoped to find more food. They moved slowly through the tall grass. The man walked ahead, while the woman stayed close behind. Every few steps, he turned around to make sure she was still there. And every time their eyes met, She gave him a small, reassuring smile. Their journey continued for hours. Eventually, they reached a wide, open valley. There were trees, water, and plenty of plants. It looked like a perfect place to rest. But something was wrong. The birds had suddenly become silent. The animals that normally moved through the grass had disappeared. The man stopped. He listened carefully. Then he heard it. A deep sound coming from somewhere nearby. The group became alert. A predator was close. Everyone began moving toward the rocky hills. The young woman slipped on the wet ground. The man immediately turned back. He grabbed her hand and helped her stand. But behind them, the tall grass suddenly moved. The predator was coming closer. The man pulled the woman toward the rocks. The group hurried away. For a few terrifying moments, the wilderness became a blur of movement. Grass shook. Footsteps struck the wet ground. The couple ran together. The woman was struggling to keep up. The man slowed down instead of leaving her behind. He stayed beside her. Finally, they reached a rocky area where the predator could no longer easily follow. They were safe, but the experience had left them. The morning came quietly. The sun rose over the ancient African grasslands, but something felt different. The small community was unusually silent. The young woman sat near the shelter, looking toward the horizon. Her partner was beside her. For a while, neither of them moved. Then the group began preparing to leave. They had to search for food and water, just as they did every day. But before they left, they noticed that one member of their small community was missing. The group searched the surrounding area. They followed tracks through the wet grass and around the rocks. Eventually, they discovered what had happened. One of their own had died. There was no way to bring that person back. The community gathered silently. The young woman stood beside her partner, watching the others. Something was different now. They did not simply walk away. They stayed. They looked at the body. They appeared to understand that this person had been part of their group, someone they had known, someone who had shared their food, their shelter, and their struggle to survive. And perhaps, for the first time, they felt the need to say goodbye. The group carefully chose a quiet place near a rocky area. They cleared the ground. They moved stones together. The young woman watched silently. Her partner stayed beside her. Then she reached down and picked a small wildflower. She held it for a moment. Then she gently placed it near the burial place. It was a simple gesture, but it carried enormous meaning. There were no words, no ceremony like those known to modern humans. Yet there was something deeply human in what they were doing. They were remembering. They were showing respect. They were saying goodbye. The group slowly covered the burial place with stones and earth. Everyone remained silent. The young woman became emotional. Her partner placed his hand gently on her shoulder. She leaned against him. They stood together as the sun began moving. The night was quiet over prehistoric Africa. The small fire outside the rocky shelter slowly burned down, sending tiny sparks into the darkness. The young couple sat together in silence. The events of the past few days had changed them. They had witnessed danger. They had faced predators. They had experienced storms. And they had watched someone from their community disappear forever. For the first time, they were beginning to understand that life was fragile. Every person around them could be there one day and gone the next. The woman looked toward the distant burial place. It was only a small patch of earth surrounded by stones. There was nothing grand about it. No monument. No carved name. No written memory. Yet for the people who had known the person buried there, that place meant something. It was a place to remember. The next morning, the woman walked there again. Her partner followed quietly behind her. She knelt beside the stones. For several moments, she simply looked at them. Then she placed another small flower beside the burial place. Her partner sat beside her. The two remained there together. Perhaps they were remembering the person they had lost. Perhaps they were thinking about how quickly life could change. Or perhaps they were simply grateful that they were still together. The woman reached for his hand. He held it tightly. They looked toward the sunrise. A new day had begun. The same wilderness that had taken a life was now filled with golden light. Birds moved between the trees. The wind passed through the tall grass. The river continued flowing as it had for countless generations. Nature did not stop for grief. Life continued. And so did they. The couple slowly returned to their community. They gathered food. They collected water. They helped the others. They continued living. But the memory of the person they had buried remained with them. This may have been one of the earliest emotional connection. Years passed across the ancient African landscape, and the small community continued its endless struggle for survival. The seasons changed. Dry grass turned green again. Rivers became shallow and then filled once more. New generations were born, while others disappeared into the silence of the past. But the memory of those they had lost remained. The young couple continued traveling together. They had become stronger. They understood the land better. They knew where to find water. They knew which plants could provide food. And they had learned to recognize the warning signs of predators. But one thing they could never learn was how to control death. Death remained a part of their world. One evening, as the group returned to their shelter, the young woman noticed something unusual. An older member of the community was struggling to walk. The others gathered around. They offered food and water. They stayed nearby. There was no medicine, no hospital, no way to stop the natural process of aging. The young woman sat beside the elder. She gently held their hand. The elder looked at her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no need for words. The young woman understood. This person had lived a long life. They had survived countless dangers. They had watched generations grow, and now their journey was nearing its end. The young woman remained beside them through the night. Her partner stayed nearby. The fire slowly burned. The stars filled the sky, and the entire group became unusually quiet. At sunrise, the elder was gone. The community gathered around. The young woman lowered her head. Once again, they faced the same question. What should they do with the body of someone who had been part of their lives? This time, they already knew. They carried the body carefully to a quiet place. They chose an area protected by rocks. The ground was prepared. Stones were gathered. The community worked together. No one spoke. As another morning arrived over prehistoric Africa, the young couple once again stepped into the wilderness. The burial places of those they had lost remained behind them, but their memories traveled with them. They could not write names. They could not carve dates into stone. They could not create portraits. But they remembered faces. They remembered voices. They remembered gestures. And most importantly, they remembered love. The couple walked toward a distant river. The man moved carefully through the tall grass, scanning the landscape for danger. The woman followed closely. After everything they had experienced together, their bond had become even stronger. They had learned that survival was not only about strength. Sometimes survival meant trusting another person. Sometimes it meant waiting. Sometimes it meant protecting someone weaker than yourself. And sometimes it simply meant staying beside someone when they were afraid. As they approached the river, the woman suddenly stopped. She noticed something lying near the water. It was a small animal bone. She picked it up and examined it. The man watched her curiously. She placed it down again. Neither of them understood what the future would bring, but their actions were already becoming more thoughtful. They were observing the world, learning from it, passing knowledge from one person to another. This was how their community survived. Later that afternoon, they returned to the burial place. The young woman wanted to visit it again. She walked slowly toward the stones. Her partner followed. She knelt down. The place looked almost unchanged. A few plants had begun growing nearby. The stones remained where the community had placed them. She touched one gently. Her expression became emotional. She remembered the person who had been buried there. For a moment, the wilderness around her seemed to disappear. She was no longer thinking about predators. She was no longer thinking. The darkness slowly disappeared from the ancient African plains. A pale glow appeared beyond the horizon, and the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the trees. Another day had begun. The young couple woke beside their shelter and looked toward the distant grasslands. Their lives had become a rhythm of survival. Wake, search for food, find water, avoid predators, protect one another, and return before darkness. But something had changed inside them. They were no longer simply surviving from one day to the next. They were beginning to understand their place within the community. The young woman watched as the older members guided the children toward a nearby patch of edible plants. The younger adults prepared to search for food. Everyone had a role. Everyone depended on someone else. The man looked at his partner. Then they joined the others. They traveled toward a broad valley where fruit-bearing trees grew near a stream. The journey was difficult. The ground was uneven. The grass was tall. The heat was intense. But they moved together. At one point, the woman noticed that another member of the group was struggling. Without hesitation, she stopped. She helped the person cross a rocky section. The man stayed nearby to protect them both. This simple act revealed something important. Their survival was not only about the strongest individual. It was about cooperation. It was about caring for members of the group. And perhaps that same instinct would eventually shape the way humans treated the dead. When someone was alive, they mattered. And when they were gone, their memories still mattered. Later that day, the group returned to the shelter with food. Everyone gathered around. The children received pieces first. The adults shared what remained. The young couple sat together. The woman looked toward the distant burial place. Her partner noticed. He knew exactly what she was thinking about. He did not ask. He simply moved. The next morning began with a strange silence. The wind moved gently through the grass, but the young couple could sense that something was different. The community was preparing to travel again. Food was becoming scarce in their current location, and the group needed to find a safer place near water. The young couple gathered what little they could carry. They looked once more toward the rocky area where their dead had been buried. The woman paused. Her eyes remained fixed on the stones. Her partner waited patiently. After a few moments, she turned away. Together, they began walking. The journey was long. They crossed dry grasslands and rocky paths. They followed animal tracks and searched for signs of water. The sun grew hotter as the day progressed. Everyone became tired, but the group continued. Eventually, they reached a large river. The water was flowing quickly. On the opposite side stood a forest filled with trees and vegetation. It looked like a promising place to find food, but crossing the river would be dangerous. The adults carefully searched for the safest path. The young couple stayed close together. The man crossed first. He tested the shallow water with his feet. Then he turned around and reached his hand toward the woman. She stepped carefully into the river. The current pushed against her legs. For a moment, she lost her balance. The man immediately grabbed her hand. He pulled her toward him. Together, they reached the opposite bank. The woman looked at him and smiled. It was another small moment. Another reminder that survival was easier when they trusted each other. The group continued into the forest. There were fruits everywhere. Fresh leaves, roots, small animals, water. For the first time in many days, the group seemed hopeful. But the forest was not safe. Something was watching them. The young couple heard movement behind them. They stopped. The man turned slowly. Nothing was visible. The days passed beside the ancient river. The small community had found a temporary home, and for a while, life became calmer. The young couple grew more confident. They knew where to find water. They knew which plants were safe to eat. They knew where predators were most likely to appear. But the wilderness could never truly be controlled. Every sunrise brought another unknown challenge. One morning, the group noticed dark clouds gathering over the distant mountains. The air became heavy. Birds disappeared into the trees. The animals became unusually quiet. The young couple looked toward the sky. A storm was coming. The community quickly gathered what food they could and moved toward a rocky shelter. The wind became stronger. Dust swept across the grasslands. Then the rain began. It came down heavily. The river rose rapidly. Water rushed between the rocks. The young couple stayed close together as the storm surrounded them. The woman was frightened. The man held her hand. They waited. Hours passed. Eventually, the storm began to weaken. The clouds slowly opened. Sunlight returned. But the landscape had changed. Trees had fallen. Branches covered the ground. Parts of the river had overflowed. The community began checking on everyone. One of the older members was missing. The group searched along the river. They followed tracks through the wet ground. The young couple joined them. They searched until the sun began to fall. Eventually, They found the elder near a rocky area. The person had died during the storm. The community stood silently. The young woman lowered her head. She remembered the previous burials. She remembered the stones. She remembered the flowers. And she understood what would happen next. The community carefully carried the body away from the river. They found a quiet place beneath a large tree. The ground was soft from the rain. Together, they prepared the burial place. The young woman collected SE. Morning returned to the ancient African valley. The storm had passed, but the land still carried its traces. Broken branches lay across the ground. The river flowed higher than before. The grass was wet with morning dew. The young couple stepped outside their shelter and looked across the changed landscape. For a few moments, they simply stood together. Then the woman reached for his hand. They began another day. Life had to continue. The community needed food. The children needed protection. Water had to be collected. And the wilderness waited for no one. As they walked toward the river, the young woman noticed something growing beside a fallen tree. Small flowers had appeared after the rain. She stopped. She carefully picked one. Her partner looked at her. He understood why she had chosen it. Flowers had become connected to their memories of the dead. She held the flower gently in her hand. Then they continued toward the river. At the water's edge, the community gathered. The flood had brought new plants and small animals into the area. The group began searching for food. The young couple worked together. He gathered fruits from low branches. She collected edible roots. When they found something useful, they shared it with the others. Their community was slowly becoming stronger. But strength did not mean safety. Suddenly, a loud cry came from the trees. Everyone stopped. A predator was nearby. The adults immediately moved the children toward the center of the group. The young man stood beside the woman. They waited. The animal moved through the vegetation. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the predator disappeared. The group slowly relaxed. Another danger had passed. The woman looked at her partner. He smiled. They continued working. Later that afternoon, they returned to the shelter. The young woman carried the small flower she had found that morning. She looked toward the burial places in the distance. Her